All right. Hello, everyone. We are live today for our Yuri's night, which is, was on Monday. But this is our live session for that. So we are excited to have everyone here. My name is Matthew. I am one of the instructors and assistants, course developers for our online classes. I also do a lot of streaming and education work with our team. The way this is going to work today, for those of you who are familiar, please make sure you post your questions in the chat, and we will grab questions from the live chat. And today's session is focused on space travel. So right now, it's going to probably will take a few minutes for people to get in because we don't have the same streaming setup that we usually do. So it'll take a few minutes for people once we go live. So Chris, why don't you just do a quick introduction, and then I'll kind of go through some of these rules again as people filter in.
Okay, so welcome. If we moved the food dish on you, we apologize, but we're using our Twitch stream alternately with regular YouTube. So today, it's the first time we actually have a thematic Q&A session because Yuri's night was Monday, 60th anniversary of Yuri Gagarin, first human in space, kind of a big milestone. I gave a public lecture that evening. We're doing a Q&A session on the topic of future of space travel, basically. So questions are welcome on that topic. We'll take other questions too, but I'm hoping people can maintain a focus on that in recognition of this big anniversary.
Excellent. And we do start having, we are having our first viewers come in. So right now we have 29 viewers, and I expect that number to rise as we get started. Again, welcome to the chat this morning, everyone, the live question and answer session. We are excited to have you here. This is, again, our first focused chat, our first thematic question and answer session. So I think we'll start off with something relatively straightforward. So Chris, can you talk about Yuri's night, what it is, and why it's important that we celebrate this anniversary?
Yeah, so Yuri's night is April 12th every year. It's a celebration of the day in 1961 when Yuri Gagarin became the first human in space. Obviously a huge milestone in human technology and exploration in our potential to get off the Earth. And Yuri's Night has been celebrated really worldwide. It's a worldwide holiday. It's actually very much adopted by young people. So there are parties, kind of wild parties actually. Europe really embraced Yuri's Night. So there are wild parties in many, many cities around the world. During the pandemic, obviously, that's not been happening. And I do get the feeling, although Yuri's Night is celebrated in the United States, not quite as big a deal in the US as in Europe and elsewhere in the world, probably because of the rivalry between the US and Russia. We don't just want to celebrate Yuri Gagarin that much. But his achievement was incredible. The bravery to be the first man in space, the first human in space when nobody really knew if you could survive it. Space travel was extremely dangerous through the 1960s. Gagarin had an adventurous life. He died tragically at age 34 in a pretty routine training flight in a MiG, which seemed to have been caused by an unauthorized other type of military aircraft breaking the sound barrier near his plane, which was in thick cloud, and his plane went into an uncontrolled dive, and he was killed at a very young age, unfortunately. But we still celebrate his achievement now, 60 years later.
So I think that brings us to an excellent place to start. So how dangerous is it for people to travel in space? Can you talk about some of those, some of the possible dangers, and and how risky is it?
I think in terms of people who've been into orbit or attempts to go into orbit, the formal death rate since the beginning of the space era 60 years ago is about 2%. That's pretty low. That's similar to the death rate amongst serious climbers, mountain climbers. and that's actually lower than the death rate in some much more dangerous activities like base jumping or flying using a wingsuit, for example. The death rates there can be 5 to 10% per time you do the activity. So space travel is, of course, dangerous. 2% is still quite a fatality rate for any activity. And some of the tragedies have been, really sad. Apollo 1 fire killed 3 astronauts. It was based on the pure oxygen in the capsule, and they died on the launch pad just during a test for the first Apollo flight. Soviet cosmonauts have died in orbit and one on landing. And there was a terrible explosion early in the Soviet space program which killed apparently 17. It's not entirely clear how many people were killed on the ground, but probably 17 with a lot of injuries. So it's dangerous. There's no question about it. And we think, of course, as the program develops and as commercial entities start operating, it will continue to be dangerous, but it'll start to be a more routine thing to do.
That's kind of interesting. So can you talk a little bit about the history of private companies in space? So what private companies are doing space now, and has that always been the case? When did that start?
Right. So for most of the history of the space program, it was the purview of governments. It was so expensive and difficult to do that really only governments could afford it. And for most of that history, it was just 2 governments. It was the former Soviet Union, now Russia, and the United States. A more recent entrant is China, and now India, Brazil, and other countries have their own space programs. The private sector is a relatively recent entrant to this. The entire private sector's interest in space was kicked off by something called the X Prize, which was a challenge prize of $10 million, I think, awarded to the first private entity, commercial entity, that could do 2 repeated suborbital flights within a week. The formal definition of space is called the Kármán line. It's 100 kilometers. That's not actually true Earth orbit. It's suborbital. But if you go up that high, it looks dark and black. You look like you're in space. And the winning of the X Prize in an aircraft designed by Burt Rutan really kicked into activity this whole thing a couple of decades ago. And since then, various entities have grown. The 2 biggest and most powerful and most successful space companies now are SpaceX, which gets a lot of publicity, and everyone knows who Elon Musk is, and Blue Origins, which is a little more publicity averse as a company and is run by Jeff Bezos. Not by chance, Bezos and Musk, in that order, are the 2 richest men in the world, richest people in the world. Their fortunes are close to $200 billion each. It takes serious revenues and serious resources to do private space. But there are probably 30 entities worldwide that are doing private space travel, and it's just increasing steadily. It's still in the research phase. We don't have routine tourists going into space, but that's probably coming within 5 years.
Can you talk a little bit about which countries have space programs as of now? What government organizations are there putting people or things in space?
So for the first few decades after the space era, of course, launched with Sputnik in 1957. That was the first artificial satellite in orbit, first human in orbit, 1961. So these are the landmarks. And for the first few decades, really only the United States and Russia, or the former Soviet Union, were engaged in this. And it was a very intense rivalry, obviously culminating in the race to the moon, which was won by the Americans. So the Russians essentially set most of the first records in space, first satellite, first man in orbit, first woman in orbit, first soft object landed on the moon, etc. But after that, the United States invested heavily in the Apollo program, and then the United States sort of took the driver's seat. In the last decade, the Chinese, starting probably 20 years ago, but in the last 5 or 6 years, a crescendo of activity from the Chinese. They have their own rockets, their own taikonauts, as they're called. The Russians are cosmonauts and the Americans are astronauts. And so the Chinese are now ascendant in this activity. because the International Space Station involves many countries, a large number of countries have had astronauts. On the space station, I think, have been representatives of over 30 different countries. So a lot of countries have had their own astronauts. But countries other than Russia, China, and the United States who have serious space programs, I would say, are India, which is definitely ambitious and has had a launch to the moon, Brazil, and Japan. Those three countries are also quite active in the space, and there are other countries that aspire to it. But it's a pretty select club.
So one of our live participants, Cat Sleuth, mentioned that growing up, they didn't hear much about Yuri Gagarin or Yuri Gagarin's achievement, probably because they were in the U.S., but they heard about Telstar launch and John Glenn's orbit. Can you talk a little bit about how these various spaceflight milestones were received around the world? Were the Europeans more aware of the Russian space achievements, or was everything, in the West focused on the American space program?
I think the awareness for the first decade or so of the space program was born out of the intense superpower rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union. Remember, 1957, the Sputnik launch was just at the back end of the Cold War, a very dark time in the history of that superpower rivalry, with some very twitchy moments like the Cuban Missile Crisis only a few years before. The threat and the ominous undercurrent of the space program was weapons in space. And so that was the concern. So I think most of the focus of not just people in the US and Russia, but also Europeans and everyone in the world was, oh no, let's not have weapons in space. It's fine to explore space and reach these landmarks, but there was a real concern that space could be weaponized, that it could be a projection of nuclear power into orbit. And so that's what people were worried about. The achievements were significant, though. People were learning how to build more reliable rockets. They were learning how astronauts, what they needed to survive in space, how to get them back safely, how to safeguard the systems with redundancy so that if you lost a computer or you lost one rocket, it wasn't the end of the mission and the death of the astronauts. So there was a long learning curve, and we know, as with Apollo 13, that there were some close calls. There were situations where nobody died, but they easily could have. So again, very hazardous activity, and I think the world's focus was on, especially for the moon launches, that was the focus for the entire world, because that was for all mankind, that they, as they said, when they stepped foot on the moon, it wasn't just for the United States or for one country.
The next question from Tabas Meta is, do we need special types of engines to send humans into space, or can we do it with normal engines that we use to send satellites and other unmanned vehicles into space?
So the rockets that are used for space travel for either satellites or humans are essentially the same type of technology, and they're really not hugely changed from the first liquid fueled rocket of Robert Goddard in 1926. That was really the beginning of modern rocketry. Then we moved forward into the Second World War era, when Wernher von Braun, before he went back to the United States to work for NASA, had developed the V-2 rockets. And then, of course, we had the various rockets that launched missiles or were used for weaponry. And these rockets and the Apollo and the Soyuz are all the same technology. This is liquid fuel technology. It's chemical energy. It's highly volatile liquid fuel. That's why it's dangerous, because this fuel, if it's treated badly or has a serious condition, can explode. And rather than a controlled burn, it can be an explosion. But it's really the same fuel. And Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and the people doing the private space sector, they've refined the rocket design, but the fuel hasn't really changed. It's got a little more efficient. It's the most highly volatile, refined fuel that you can get energy out of, but it's chemical energy. And that's probably the biggest shortcoming of the space program at the moment, that we haven't really explored alternate propulsion mechanisms with any great commitment yet.
The next question is from Isla 137. Can you please tell us more about a space elevator? Things like construction, stability, materials. What would that take, and how feasible is it?
So a space elevator is a very interesting concept. It's the idea, it sounds like an Indian rope trick really, of suspending a cable made of a very light and high tensile strength material like carbon nanotubes, for example, suspending a cable up into space, well into space, way beyond Earth orbit, where the weight of the cable downward by gravity is balanced by the centrifugal force of the spinning Earth. And you can do the math and work that out, and you can figure out how far into space that cable has to extend. And the challenge, of course, that's in principle. The challenge in practice for a space elevator is, can you find a real material that has enough strength to hold its own weight when it's extending tens of thousands of kilometers into the air and into space? And for the Earth, the answer to that question at the moment is no. We do not have a material strong enough to build a space elevator on the Earth. We do actually just about have material strong enough to build one on the moon, which is 1/6 the gravity, so it's less of a challenge. Now, what is the point of a space elevator? Why do you want to do this? Well, it's a game changer because almost all the energy cost of getting into space is fighting against the Earth's gravity. When you saw the giant Saturn V rocket with the tiny Apollo capsule on top, it was 95% of the mass of that entire combined rocket was fuel that was just going to be burned to get that small capsule into orbit and then eventually to the moon. So that's the incredible wastefulness, if you like, of having to just use huge amounts of fuel and just carry that fuel and then burn it to overcome gravity. If you can build a space elevator, essentially that job is done. You just have a cable and you can build solar powered elevators or lifters attached to the cable, and things can essentially ride up and down for zero cost to Earth orbit. And so you take the huge energy and rocket fuel cost of launching to Earth orbit now and reduce it almost to nothing. So it's a huge game changer. The technologies, as I mentioned, for a space elevator on the Earth do not yet exist. The designs do, and engineers have worked through a lot of the issues, the instabilities of such a cable and its failure modes and so on. So the engineering designs are mostly in place. All we need are sufficiently strong and tensile materials to construct such a thing. And it'll be done first, if we do it at all, on the moon, I think.
Excellent. That's really interesting. Um, kind of building on some of this, David Learning would like to know what are some of the latest technologies that we use every day that have been offshoots of the space program or space travel programs?
So there have been various spin-offs from the space program. NASA touts them on one of its websites. The famous example that people like to give in conversation is Teflon. So we got non-stick frying pans out of the space program, and that's a kind of a humorous, almost trivial example. But less trivially, working in space has forced people to develop new materials that basically are light and very strong, or impervious to impacts or to the vacuum of space. So I think the space activity has led people to develop very strong and powerful materials out of which to build rockets, out of which to build their engines, which are subject to huge stresses. Um, it's also improved the technology of propulsion. Even though we're using chemical fuel rockets, the current rockets are exceptionally efficient in how they use that fuel, and they're light and powerful. So we've learned a lot about that. We've also learned how to survive in a self-contained way, because the space station is a sort of a orbiting hotel, and people have spent months and sometimes years there without coming back down. So you have to be able to process waste, you have to be able to recycle water, you have to be able to protect them from a space environment that includes micrometeorites that can be fatal if they puncture the skin of the space station. So we've learned a lot of things about how to live and work in space in the last 30 years.
Excellent. The next question is from Cat Sleuth. What do you think about the announcement that DARPA is planning to put nuclear-powered rockets or a nuclear-powered rocket in orbit by 2025?
Yes, it's been announced. DARPA, which is the Defense Advanced Research something agency. I'm not sure what the actual acronym stands for. Um, it's going to put nuclear-powered rockets in orbit. Now, the nuclear-powered rocket is a better propulsion technology, so it's a step forward from chemical energy. The controversy, of course, has been to have nuclear-powered anything in orbit brings you into the regime where you have to worry about weapons. So this would have to be an agreement among the various space powers, China and Russia, obviously, that the United States can do that and has no evil intent. Now, a rocket engine powered by nuclear powers is quite different from a bomb, a nuclear bomb. The 1965 Space Treaty, signed at the UN by essentially all world powers, all the major spacefaring powers, prohibits weapons in space, nuclear or other, chemical or otherwise. And so I think the United States signed that treaty and will adhere to it. So I don't think people should worry about nukes in space from nuclear engines. However, Congress and the government has been very loath to put anything radioactive or nuclear of any kind in space. For quite a while, NASA was not allowed to use radioactive powered sources for their missions to the outer solar system, where there's not enough solar energy to use solar panels. You can use nuclear power, radioactive decay power, and even putting modest amounts of radioactive material out into space and far from the Earth was controversial, and NASA couldn't do it for a while. So the whole thing of nuclear energy and nuclear power in space is going to be controversial, and I think we'll have to see how that plays out, whether Congress expresses concerns or whether other countries express concerns. It's not yet clear.
One of our viewers would like to know if you are familiar with any projects that Brazil is doing involving space exploration or space travel.
I'm not sure. I don't know in detail about Brazil's space program, but I know that they're now one of the top tier of space powers in that second group behind the U.S., Russia, and China. They, along with Japan and India, have significant ambitions. I know there have been more than one, I think, Brazilian astronaut on the International Space Station that they were taken up on a Russian launch vehicle, I'm sure. So Brazil has not had its own astronaut program yet, but it does have quite a vigorous space program of launching satellites, of developing space technologies, and I think they do have ambitions to launch their own astronauts.
So just a quick welcome to all the folks who have joined us in the last few minutes. We appreciate you joining us, and today we are talking about Yuri's night and space travel specifically. So post your space travel questions in the chat and space exploration questions in the chat. We're going to prioritize space exploration and space travel this week. So if there are other questions that we have a chance to get to, we will get to those. But if you have space exploration and space travel questions, those are our priority for this special space exploration session. So again, post those in the chat. We're well underway. Our next question from one of our participants, Sharp-Tailed Girl: have any real estate ownership issues arisen regarding Earth orbits, Lagrange points, the Moon, or Mars?
Yes, the issues of ownership of property in space has come up. The short answer is there is no authority. There's no regulatory authority or set of laws, international or really national, that relate to space. In many countries, in principle, if you own a piece of property, you can draw lines upward from the edge of your property out into space, and you own the airspace above your property. Not that that's obvious what that means to anyone. But the issue of the ownership of space property has never been resolved. The United Nations had the Moon Treaty of 1979, which was designed to address this, and it basically said that governments could not claim ownership over the Moon or other space bodies like Mars and asteroids and so on. And that means, of course, that the Apollo landing sites, which may seem very special to Americans, those footprints of those first astronauts, that is not owned by the United States. It's not a national preserve. It's not off limits to anyone else. And that could become an issue as people start to go to the Moon. The Moon Treaty also was mute about commercial entities. I guess at that time, 1979, it was not imagined that a company could ever be powerful or rich enough to do its own space travel. And so the Moon Treaty had left these all unresolved. And so at the moment, it's a Wild West. It's open for interpretation of some yet future world court, say, of what happens when people start making competing claims over, say, mineral resources on the moon or Mars or an asteroid. These things are all unresolved. And as a sidebar on that, space law is a niche area of law, but it's actually growing as the commercial activity in space grows and as these ownership issues start to get on the table. Space law is a growing niche of law, and there are more than a handful of universities now that have space law programs.
The next question is from E.J. Willrich. Have we made any real advances in fusion technology, specifically as a means of space travel, or is this still just a cosmic wish?
I think the answer, unfortunately, is no, because we've not yet made dramatic progress in fusion as an energy source on the Earth. So with investments of $100 million a year or so for decades, we still do not have a viable fusion reactor. The nuclear reactors that exist around the world and provide 15% or so of the world's energy are fission reactors. Fusion has not been demonstrated in a self-sustaining reaction for longer than a fraction of a second anywhere in a research lab or a research facility. So if we can't even do it on the Earth, then the idea of miniaturizing these large facilities and somehow getting them into space is way beyond us. So unfortunately, I think fusion power as a means of moving around the solar system and beyond is decades away, and maybe even more than that.
One of our live participants would like to know, can you talk about commercial and academia industry partnerships and endeavors, excuse me, in the space industry? So commercial and academic industry partnerships, and what opportunities do you think there are in the field, and what has been done so far?
Yes, they're modest at this point. The main private space companies are mostly concerned about generating a viable economic model and actually generating some revenues. SpaceX has been the first to show the potential to be profitable because they were given multi-billion-dollar contracts to resupply the space station with their unmanned rockets, and as we all know, recently they succeeded in launching astronauts. The first time American astronauts had been able to be launched by an American capability for a decade since the demise of the space shuttle. So that's their business model, and they do have some small-scale partnerships with academia and researchers and universities, but that's not their main focus right now. Their main focus is just increasing the reliability of their rockets, generating revenue, which will not come from academic partnerships, of course, and showing that they can do what they do safely. Actually, ironically, NASA has had many more academic partnerships in its history than the commercial sector has partnerships. NASA has always worked with universities, and they're very tight relationships between scientists at the NASA research labs and university scientists.
So that kind of brings up a question. Will the costs come down or when will the costs come down for getting things into Earth orbit, and how much can we expect those costs to drop?
I think they have come down, and they will come down more. The key innovation made by SpaceX and Blue Origins is reusing the rockets. If you think of the Apollo missions and Saturn V rocket as your example, these huge rockets, had enormous fuel tanks that were essentially just jettisoned. These enormous and expensive pieces of hardware were jettisoned, and they were not really reusable. You've seen video, I'm sure, of SpaceX's rockets launching and re-landing on an offshore platform or on the land. Blue Origins has done this too. As soon as you can reuse your rocket, you've changed the economics of this. So basically, in the last decade, after the price per kilo into Earth orbit not coming down by more than a factor of 2 or 3 over 20 years, in the last decade, the 2010s, this cost per kilo to Earth orbit has reduced from $10,000 a kilo to $1,000 a kilo. That's a factor of 10 in 10 years. That's an enormous progress. And that's a sign of the innovation of these new space companies. So if you do the simple math, a human, or used to using pounds in the United States, a human is 60 or 70 kilos. That means the cost of putting a person in orbit has come down under $100,000. And that the full cost of a ticket will, of course, be more than that. So the cost is probably a few $100,000 at this point. But that's not a ridiculous amount. The very first space tourists a decade ago going up in Soyuz paid $15 or $10 million each for the privilege. I think if the cost comes down further, which it should, probably by another factor of 3 or 5 in the next decade, it's getting harder to improve. You're using the same technology. At the point where the cost per kilo into Earth orbit is down to a few $100s, at that point, the game is on. At that point, the cost of an Earth orbit trip is the cost of a very expensive cruise or something like that. And then you have a big market.
One of our participants, Mr. Cobb, would like to know, are there ethical concerns that we ought to have or think about with colonizing other celestial bodies, or are they really just up for grabs?
It's a good question, and yes, there are ethical concerns, or there should be, and there are, and people involved in this are thoughtful and they take these things seriously. I'll start with NASA. NASA is actually quite thoughtful and conscious about this. NASA has had a position for decades called the Planetary Protection Officer, and that person is concerned with two things in our space exploration from NASA: that we do not contaminate other bodies unnecessarily, and so when missions that you see right now go to Mars or the Moon, they sterilize on the way or when they get there, and they try not to leave unnecessary debris on those planets. They also worry about back contamination. If we start bringing samples back from Mars, as we did from the Moon decades ago, then we might worry if there are microbes on board or some pathogens. And so NASA takes that very seriously. That's the level of ethical concern that NASA displays. The larger issue of do we have the right to take virgin bodies in space like the Moon and Mars and build on them, build habitats or colonies, or alter their surfaces, or in the most extreme case, terraform them so that we could live there. That's not really, it's on the table, but it's not stopping the activity. And again, there's no overarching international body that can adjudicate this. It's up to the goodwill, if you like, or the inclination of the players doing this. And governments may take this into consideration because their citizens care about it, and they know they do, like NASA. But private companies are beholden really only to their shareholders, and so they could maybe face public opinion and pressure from the public, but that's a little indirect. So these ethical considerations, it's not really clear yet how they're going to be handled. They're still mostly in the future, but there could be some interesting and maybe awkward scenarios playing out.
So kind of related, I'm going to jump ahead to another question from E.J. Wilrich. Space law is an area of study of theirs, and they recently contacted a former law school to ask the dean to start a space law survey course in preparation for this emerging area of law. Where do you think they should start? Should they begin with the study of the 1967 Outer Space Treaty and study implications of its revision, or should they start somewhere else?
Well, yes. If you're going to get into space law, then it's very interesting because it's a multinational activity, space. So you want to start in your analogizing with terrestrial law. You have to start with the kind of law that holds across national boundaries, because that's the most likely law that will project into space. So I would say part of a space law program would have to be a pretty careful analysis of what transnational legal frameworks that can be imposed between countries, and therefore potentially with those countries and their citizens' activities in space. In the regulatory sense, there's no regulatory framework. The two UN treaties, the Outer Space Treaty of 1965 and the Moon Treaty of 1979, those are the only treaties the United Nations has ever put together, ratified by the superpowers, at least for the most part, that deals with space issues. There's no sign of a new one. There's probably time for a new one. And so the United Nations would obviously be a place for this. But there are other aspects of law that are relevant here too. There's the issues of liability, there's the issues of insurance and malpractice and so on. So there's whole sectors of law that are really not very well worked out. Or what happens if two companies that are both mining or inhabiting the moon or Mars come into conflict with each other? Well, who will adjudicate that, and how will they resolve those differences? So there's tons of hypothetical casework and potential casework to explore. It's a very rich subject, but most of it, of course, still lies in the future. So I think it's still a small niche.
Hernan Reyes, who's on with us live, would like to know, has a space travel question about traveling to Saturn's moons. So traveling to Saturn's moons takes many months. If and when astronauts go out that far, will it be better to send them in a form of suspended animation or as an awake and live crew?
So human travel to the outer solar system is an interesting thing to consider, because at the moment we're just talking about Mars, and we know that the most rapid, efficient way to get to Mars is a 6 or 8 month journey. So it's not a crazy length of time if we were going to the outer solar system. And a usual mission takes a decade. And so we're talking about probably 5 to 8 years with a reasonable trajectory for astronauts to get to the outer solar system, and the same amount back. So this is a good chunk of a lifetime, and the question of whether it's better to do suspended animation or not is not clear. First of all, we don't have the technology to do it, and you'd have to be very sure of the reanimation process to know that you hadn't just killed your astronauts without knowing you were. People who do such an adventure might indeed be willing to spend the heart of their life doing it, and so commit 15 or 20 years to that activity. So it's not clear that you need suspended animation. The dangers, of course, are enormous. Going to Mars in a normal space capsule, you would have the radiation dose equivalent to your entire lifetime just from that 6 months. So because it's so expensive to put heavy cladding on a spacecraft, you can't do it. And essentially, even if the astronauts are wearing protective gear within the spacecraft, their exposure to radiation, cosmic rays, and high energy particles through that long voyage and return voyage is going to constitute a significant risk to them and a significant increased chance of death. But the journey itself is dangerous too at a very high level. So it's not clear whether we're going to do this and how we're going to do it. At the moment, NASA is only committed to robotic exploration of the outer solar system. It's really not come up yet to send people to the outer solar system, because if you think about it, the earliest time NASA is talking about putting anyone on Mars is over a decade away, probably 15 years away. So that's 2035 before we even get the first astronauts on Mars. To the outer solar system, it's got to be decades after that.
The next question is from a live viewer. Egil Scala says, there doesn't seem to be much interest in the moons of Mars, Deimos and Phobos, even though they are the next two closest moons to us. Why is that, either for robotic spacecraft or human visitation?
Well, there's some interest in them. Phobos and Deimos are two sort of irregular potato-shaped moons. They're very small moons compared to the Earth's moon, which is a very large moon compared to almost all moons in the solar system. And so partly it's that they're small and perhaps uninteresting for that part. Mars itself has such rich geology and such rich variation in its geology and topology that I think Mars is the main draw. Phobos and Deimos are not of great interest, even maybe to geologists. And so that's part of it, that Mars is such a big attraction for future exploration. But once you have a base on Mars, then you could actually do some significant investigation of those two moons and learn a lot more about them now than you can do now with telescopes on the ground.
Excellent. Here's another question that I think I missed a little bit earlier. JC5892 asks, do you think it's better for us to visit, or I guess, have a visit from, well, I guess it would have to be a visit to, but would it be better to visit or contact a very advanced civilization or one that's just getting started?
Um, that's an interesting question. We don't necessarily get to choose, of course, because we don't even know if they exist at all. Um, if we visited a civilization that's just getting started, of course, we could be paternalistic and think that we might help them and help them advance and maybe avoid some of the mistakes that we'd made at developing our technology. So if they're an early stage civilization, they presumably don't yet have space travel. So that would imply that we'd ventured to their star system and their planet and just found them in an early stage of development. Depending on how early that stage of development was and what kind of creatures they were, I mean, we might appear godlike and amazing to them. And the converse is true. And a more advanced civilization might be difficult to recognize and certainly difficult to understand or communicate with. Arthur C. Clarke famously said, any sufficiently advanced civilization is indistinguishable from magic. And so the capabilities of an advanced civilization might be such that we simply couldn't understand them because we could not access the tools or those technologies. And it's not clear, therefore, that that would be helpful to us if they were so much more advanced than us. Really, the best bet is to find a civilization that's just slightly more advanced than you so you can get helped along the road of developing your technology.
Elia137 asks, can you talk about physiological considerations for spending time in space? And sort of related, is there a maximum time limit that humans can stay in space?
These are important issues now, and they've been studied by the Russian and American space programs. And because of the space station, the longevity record, it's a Soviet cosmonaut that has the longevity record. And it's several years. I can't remember exactly how many days, maybe 800 or 900 days. And in that amount of time, or even in a year, the famous Kelly twin brothers, the American astronauts, one was stayed on the ground and the other one spent a year in the space station. They've done medical studies about the differences that emerge having one of a pair of an identical twin in orbit and the other stay on the ground. So there are definite medical consequences to extended time in zero gravity. Some of them are obvious, wasting of the muscles, deterioration of the muscles, loss of bone mass, various changes in the shape in, for instance, the eye socket. These are uncomfortable changes, actually. The lack of gravity affects a lot of the vascular systems in the human body, and they've documented a lot of these, and they're significant, they're profound. And if you have extended period of time in space, these health consequences can be quite significant. Now, people on Mars will be subject to 140% gravity, Earth gravity, and that may be enough to avoid some of these effects. But extended time in zero gravity really does have medical consequences because we were never designed for that.
So then a related question, what about psychological considerations for spending time in space? Have there been studies done, and what are the problems associated with that?
That's a real concern, and that's a big issue in the selection of astronauts. So astronauts, whether they're in the United States or Russia or China or Europe or anywhere, are selected, obviously based on a battery of psychological tests as well as all the physical tests. And the psychological tests are really important. So basically the people who are selected to be astronauts are enormously competent and self-contained. They don't panic easily. They're very resourceful. They know how to stay on task. They have their own internal resources to deal with difficult and stressful situations. And they're pretty stable personalities, obviously, don't have any underlying psychological disorder. Now, as civilians or tourists start to go into space, because this is going to be a revenue-generating proposition, and they won't be spending long there, those selection is probably not going to be made like that. But when the first colonists on Mars and Moon are selected, a very hazardous assignment, a very stressful situation, then these psychological issues will come to the fore again. It's also not completely a science. It's not completely clear how to pick astronauts or colonists or anyone like that, because there's no simple or set of psychological tests that can fully diagnose how a human will react to an unknown and novel situation. You can think you know, but you don't know. Humans are not fully predictable. There are wild cards. So there's always going to be a little uncertainty and this possibility of stress leading to conflict. And that has to be taken into consideration.
The next question is from David Learning. What place, for example, a theme park or research center, has the best space travel simulation experience today?
Well, the best one is not really open to the public. So Johnson Space Center had a shuttle simulator, and that, it's a pretty close version of the shuttle, and it's all beat up, and it's been used by all the astronauts. Apollo, Gemini, and Mercury astronauts used it, even if they didn't go on the space shuttle. I think both Kennedy Space Center is probably the best one, and Johnson Space Center, in their parts that are open for the public, they have a sort of theme park-ish flavor to them. They each have a sort of space ride that's, getting close towards a simulator type experience. And there are actually other science museums that have this now. It's not unique just to NASA centers. So it's not too hard to find these kind of simulators in the main NASA centers or in actually some theme parks or some science museums.
Tapas Meta asks, do we have technologies at present, or are there any plans which might help in the future humans to do deep space travel to distant solar systems and or galaxies?
So I think traveling to other galaxies is beyond the realm of possibility, really maybe ever, because we're talking about millions of light years distance, and we're never going to go close to light speeds. The energy costs are too extreme. Traveling to other star systems is something that is on the horizon. It's a far horizon, but it's possible. It will require new technologies. It will require new propulsion technology to, at the very least, get us to a few percent of light speed. Maybe that's solar sails, maybe that's ramjets that are sucking hydrogen out of the interstellar medium and using it for fusion or fission power. In other words, instead of carrying fuel with you, you grab your fuel as you go. So it'll need those propulsion technologies, and then, even then, at a few percent or 5% of the speed of light, it'll be several generations to reach the nearest star systems. So that means we'll need suspended animation techniques. And the medical research on suspended animation, just born out of trying to keep people alive when they have heart attacks or fall under ice or whatever, there's some interesting progress in that regard, where pigs and dogs and other animal models of humans have been reanimated, have been taken into essentially a suspended animation state and reanimated after weeks or days. Weeks mostly, they don't survive. So it's experimental technology, but in a few decades maybe it'll be good enough to use on humans. And at that point, with suspended animation technology and new propulsion method based on fusion, probably, the stars are within reach. But that time scale is clearly no less than 100 years. I'm going to guess 100 to 150 years from now.
So then, kind of a follow-up to that, if travel to distant galaxies or even exoplanets seems out of reach, are we surprised, or why are we surprised that aliens have not come to visit us, seeing as that not being able to travel faster than light is a serious limiting factor?
Right, I agree with the premise of the question. I agree that we shouldn't be surprised. It's a double negative, but we shouldn't be surprised that they haven't visited, because space travel is hard, as we're finding out. We have the ability to leave the Earth. We have the ability, at least, to travel to the nearest rock in space, the moon. It's incredibly difficult. Some of the Apollo missions, which sent 24 people to the moon, and 12 of them stepped on it, that cost in inflation-adjusted dollars about $280 billion, an enormous amount of money. And that's just to get to the moon. That's not even venturing in the solar system. So if it's that hard, even given our technology, then it's going to be hard for anyone. And so unless intelligent life is very liberally sprinkled through the galaxy, it's likely that the vastness of space just means this is a very difficult thing, and that not many civilizations, even if they have intelligence and develop a civilization, are able to do it, and some may not be interested in doing it. That's another reason. So I think the absence of visitors, or the absence of any sign that aliens are traveling around the galaxy, should not be surprising to anyone, because there are quite sensible reasons why it may not have happened, or it may be very difficult, or if it's happened, it's very rare.
The next question is from Sidi Sakrodia, who asks, how come the footprints on the moon are still there?
That's a good question. They're there because the moon has no atmosphere, and it's not geologically active. And the atmospheric cycle and the geology of the Earth are what make the Earth's surface reform over and over again. So the erosion and weathering of the Earth is extreme. The moon has no weathering and no erosion. It has no wind. And so there is nothing to disturb a footprint. There's nothing to disturb the surface at all. The only thing that disturbs the surface is the thing that made it this fine talcum-like powder, which is micrometeorite impacts over hundreds of millions and billions of years. So the lunar regolith, the technical name for soil of another world, is a very fine powder. And because it's such a fine powder, it held the footprint. It made a beautiful footprint of all the astronauts and the tracks of their rovers. And because there's nothing in the environment to make it go away or disturb it, either geologically or atmospherically, they will stay for centuries, millennia.
The next question is, with all of the sort of space industries popping up, United Launch Alliance and SpaceX and Blue Horizon, is NASA, or I guess is NASA still competitive at putting people into space, or do you think they will ever cease being competitive putting people in space?
The relationship between NASA and the private sector space industries is an interesting one. Clearly, there was a time at which NASA was not competitive at putting people into space, because there was very close to a decade when the United States could not put astronauts into Earth orbit without help from the Russians and their Soyuz rocket. And that was an embarrassment, I would say, to the Americans, and a sign of strategic disadvantage. And so that was due to the limitations of the shuttle program. Shuttle was very expensive. Its true cost to launch, all things added in, was about $500 million each launch. 2 out of the 5 orbiters were lost with all hands on deck catastrophically. That's not a good failure rate. 2 out of your 5 orbiters destroyed. So that was the big problem for NASA for a long time. And in the end, it was a partnership with SpaceX that got NASA out of that hole and led to Americans being launched again for the first time in almost a decade, just last year. So now NASA is quite smart, realizing they can't do it all, but they do have enormous talent in all the NASA centers. They do have $18 or $19 billion budget, significant budget every year. It rolls in like the tide pretty much. Their budget doesn't go up much, but it doesn't go down. They've decided that partnering with the private sector and incentivizing the private sector is the best way to go. So it's been good for both sides, because it's given a revenue stream to SpaceX in particular when SpaceX did not have a viable model based on tourism. And it's helped NASA because it got NASA to a place that it hadn't been for a decade, of putting people into orbit again. So it's a fruitful partnership both sides. That's the most prominent example, but there's actually a whole spectrum of public-private partnerships within NASA on propulsion technologies, on light materials for living on the moon and building habitats, on building a space elevator, for example. So NASA is partnering with the private sector in a number of ways, and I think they're smart to do so.
So then another question that we have from email is, with these private industries, how will that be impacted by the entry of someone, another entity like China? How will that affect space travel? And what are China's plans for space travel and exploration?
So China's role in the future of space is an interesting one. China had a slow start, but for until a recent downturn in the economy with the pandemic, China's economy was growing at 8 to 10% a year for a couple of decades, and they were growing their space program at that rate. That means you double your budget every 4 or 5 years, compared to stagnant or even declining in real term NASA budget, and the Russian space program is also not that well funded anymore. So China, came from behind and have come to a very high level quickly. The average age of a Chinese aerospace worker or space program workers is late 20s. The average age of a NASA civil service employee is late 50s. So it's a young activity, and they're not simply copying American or European technology now. They're building their own rockets, they're innovating in their own right, and they have great ambitions. They want to do a space station, they've already gone to the moon, they want to do a moon base, they want to do a Mars base, they want to send people to Mars. And so it's very ambitious, and of course they're funding it at a very high level. Also, it's much less transparent than the American space program. NASA was founded in 1958 as a civilian space agency. Eisenhower, the president at the time, had a choice, and his generals actually were strongly advising him to keep it within under an arm of the military so they could develop weapons and keep it secretive. And he resisted. As a general himself, he resisted, and he made NASA's charter that it be a civilian space agency, not beholden to the military, independent, with budgets that are transparent and awarded through Congress. And that's the way it's always been. So NASA's books are open to anyone who wants to see. Now, there were shuttle flights that the military had payloads on that we didn't know what those payloads were, but most of what NASA does is civilian sector. And so it's very transparent. The Chinese, by contrast, their space program is completely meshed in with their military, and it's very secretive. So we only learn about it just by, espionage, of course, and by people who just can infer what their activities are from what they launch and what they publish. And that's a concern. So it's a very different space program in China than it is in the United States.
Another question that is kind of a compilation from email and live participants. We've talked about nuclear space engines, but why is it that we are still using chemical rockets to get into space? What about other technologies such as ion engines or something like the antimatter engine in Star Trek? Is that practical?
Sure. So good question. Why has rocket technology just not evolved very much in, what seems like 60 or so years? You might ask the same question about cars. I mean, it might be amazing to an alien visiting the Earth to see that we're still using the internal combustion engine, which is a century or more old. And we might think, oh yes, we're getting electric cars. Electric cars are 3% of all the cars. So we're still in the age of gasoline engines, and that's 100-year-old technology. So that's even more perplexing, perhaps. On the front of rocketry, there's two parts of the answer. The first part of the answer is, the best chemical rockets, basically we've taken an existing technology, the chemical fuel rocket, and refined it and made it as efficient as possible with lighter and stronger materials and the most volatile, high energy output fuels. So we've sort of squeezed all we can out of chemical rockets and made some gains that way. As for why we don't try other technologies, they haven't had the investment. So there's simply been very modest levels of investment in prototypes of other propulsion technologies. Perhaps the best transition technology would be a nuclear fusion or fission even reactor where out in space you build it in orbit and then you use it. Essentially, it sounds kind of crude, but you create mini explosions, mini nuclear blasts against a blast plate, which acts as a reaction plate. And so a succession of small blasts just behind the spacecraft propel it through a back reaction faster and faster. That's a very simplistic way of doing it, but it's still more efficient than a chemical engine. Ion engines is another technology that could be done, and there are designs for all these things. So there's no physics obstruction to this. It's a pure R&D issue. And the question of the research and development was going to cost billions or tens of billions of dollars. And that's just not had that investment. More futuristic technologies like antimatter engines, those are beyond the realm of possibility, really, because we can barely make tiny amounts of antimatter at enormous cost. Antimatter is the most expensive substance in the world. I think if you had to make it out of high energy physics mechanisms, it would cost like $1 trillion a gram. So antimatter engines are not going to happen anytime soon. But basically, we need higher level of R&D in these well thought out alternative technologies that just haven't had the investment to make them real.
Excellent. Well, we are about at the end of our time, so I think we will end with one final question for today's live session. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today for this special space travel focused question and answer session. It'll take about a day to get this up on YouTube, but tomorrow you'll be able to find this up on our Astronomy State of the Art YouTube channel. But we'll end with one final question, which is why spend all of the money that we're spending on space travel when it seems like there are so many other problems on Earth? So kind of a high-level philosophical question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a very good question. Why do it at all? Why do it when we have much bigger problems on the home planet? I'm not sure that it's an either or, actually. You might say it's very expensive to launch rockets into space, but if you compare the NASA's budget to the military budget, it's not even close. The military budget in the US is 35 or I think 40 times NASA's budget. So it's a huge differential. And then the other thing worth bearing in mind is that NASA's budget is not all spent on space travel and rockets. NASA has upward of $1 billion or maybe $2 billion of its budget spent on Earth-looking science, which is basically environmental science. It's using satellites and remote sensing to understand how we use the planet, how resources are allocated, where the biggest damage to the environment is. So NASA's actually doing its part for the environment in that way with a significant chunk of its budget. So I don't think it's an either or. I think there's a part of us that is driven to explore, that is curious. The private sector also are able to do what they do, and a company that wants to do this, that has investors or shareholders that want to spend their money, or Elon Musk or Jeff Bezos, their personal fortunes earned from other companies on space travel, well, we can't really say that they can't do it for ethical reasons. It's their choice. So in a sort of free enterprise capitalistic framework, it's going to happen anyway, I think. More pertinent question is how much should government spend on it, because that's taxpayer dollars. Most taxpayers, when they're asked how much of their dollar in the United States is spent on space, they overestimate dramatically by a factor of 5 or 10. They typically say 5 or 10 cents of their tax dollar goes to NASA and space exploration. And if they're asked if that's too much, some of them say yes. But it's actually half a cent of their tax dollar. And then when they're told that, they say, no, it's fine, maybe we should spend more. So I don't think the general public in the United States, at least, thinks too much is spent on that activity relative to everything else. So I think it's a piece of what we can do. And as long as it doesn't distort our priorities, and as long as we do have serious commitment to look after the home planet, I think it's a reasonable thing. And the last point I'll make is that some of the technologies we develop for space travel and for, in the future, living on the moon and Mars are actually technologies that will teach us how to live more parsimoniously and efficiently on the Earth. So they, again, have an impact on how we live on this planet and don't waste resources. So thanks again for all your questions. It was quite a fruitful session on this special topic. We'll go back to our regular anything to do with astronomy next time. But thank you for joining me. Thanks to Matthew for facilitating, and Alexander for getting us all rolling today.
All right, thank you everyone for joining us. This was great. Our next live session will be next week. I will send out an announcement about that, and it will be on YouTube, and then we will alternate between YouTube and Twitch. Thank you all for joining us. Have a great week, rest of your week and weekend.